So we're going to hear from Laura now, who's going to take us through the Lord's Prayer. And it's just really to introduce the launching off our new series about prayer. And so what better place to start from Matthew chapter 6.
So this is from Matthew 6, from verses 5 to 13. And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. And when you pray, do not keep on babbling like pagans, for they think they will be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. This, then, is how you should pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we have also forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one.
Okay, thanks so much for that, Laura. And yeah, just to kick us off, in relation to this series, we'll be doing the prayer course on a Wednesday from this week. And it's a course that's supported by some really great resources. So the first one is the book, How to Pray by Pete Greig, who has put the course together and the founder of the 24/7 prayer movement. And our own very Lizzie Lowry has put together some amazing, just really kind of snappy, kind of short cards for the prayer course, which has some great summaries on for each kind of like week that you can kind of work through should you just want something a little bit briefer. And we'll be giving these out to anyone who wants to come on the course. So whether you actually are from Crosby or whether you're further afield, we'll post them out to you and ensure that you have something to work along with us. So we'd really like to invite you to come on that journey. So get your resource, get your Teachers to Pray pamphlets, and it's definitely worth an investment in this book. Some of the stuff that we'll be going through on the course is from there. So this morning, this is just basically a bit of an introduction to what is a massive topic, and we're not going to be able to do justice in the moments we've got. But this morning, I just want to really be able to encourage you, help you understand that prayer is just such an important part of our lives as Christians. So the disciples asked Jesus, Lord, teach us how to pray. Well, one of my first earliest memories of what I would say was really fervent prayer was 1994. Leeds United had won what would have been the Premier League equivalent a few years before, playing Oxford United in the FA Cup. But as you'll know, Oxford United, not a very good team. Leeds were 2-0 down at home with minutes to go. And at this point, I remember sinking to my knees and crying out to God in heaven to come and to turn this around, because the embarrassment of going to school with this kind of scoreline hanging over me as a Leeds supporter, well, they pulled it back to 2-2 with minutes to go, and praise be to the Lord, but then lost 3-2 in extra time. And to be fair, I felt like God had kind of done his bit. And that was one of my first moments actually engaging. I remember it for kind of vividly. Libby's got a great story of a lady called Jo. Jo, if you're watching, you're a legend, who for the first time praying in a prayer meeting, she was a new Christian, and they were praying against the stranglehold of communism, the influence of the Stasi secret police, and the reunification of Germany. But it was the 8th of November, 1989, and that night, the Berlin Wall fell down. And it was fair to say that Jo's confidence in prayer was pretty well buoyed, if not slightly naive, given the number of Christians who were also praying. Well, you know, with Prince Philip passing away, many people will be writing and considering today, you know, that he's in our thoughts and prayers. And to be human is to pray. That's a fact. but to who and also how. Albert Einstein said there's two ways to live. You can either live that nothing is a miracle or that everything is a miracle. And if God exists, if he created you and me, if he turned up in flesh and blood to demonstrate that he's on our side, if he so eagerly wants to connect with you, then maybe connecting through prayer might be worth it. In fact, maybe it might be the most important, life-changing, mind-blowing thing that you could do. In a similar way that the universe points us to the existence of God and the character of God, there's no one specific scientific God equation to prove God in that regard. And I can't prove God to you this morning through sharing stories of answered prayer. But many Christians will affirm that when we pray, stuff happens outside of the ordinary, surprises, kind of God incidents. And when we don't, they don't. And yet, in our kind of self-centered, materialistic world, we may be tempted to see prayer as kind of this mechanism that turns God into our personal slot machine. And that's something we need to get past if we're going to develop what is an effective and mature prayer life. In fact, prayer changes our perspective, and ultimately it changes us as people to become more like Jesus. And that in itself is so kind of vital. And it's a journey that we're going to have to be on to see these amazing answers and stories. Prayer finds us out, and it's prayer that brings us back in. So as Christians, prayer is not like an optional extra. It's not a sideline. It's not something for just kind of holy people out there. It's a fundamental to our relationship with God. And if we want a relationship with God, God is going to expect that we talk to him. Now, as a Christian and ultimately as a church, this is the difference between being spiritually dead or alive, being useful or useless, growing in God, or kind of being spiritually stunted. And what we see in the Bible is that all the men and women of God prayed. We might be kind of surprised at some of the prayers they said and the ones that are recorded in the Bible. You know, they're not pious religious ramblings, often dynamic, emotive, relational, conversational prayers, and with this natural expectation that the people of God will pray individually and corporately. So just going to go through a few kind of prayers in the Bible. We've got Abraham, who's got the kind of like the envious title of being a friend of God, and he bargains God down from 50 to 10 righteous people in an attempt to try and save a vile city that's neck deep in murder and sin. We've got Miriam, who sang a prayer of thanksgiving for the rescue of a country in the face of Egyptian army attack. And worship is actually almost a form of prayer as we bring kind of our praises to God. Moses interceded for his people who'd so quickly then departed from God's plan. And he's almost talking back to God when God says he's prepared to wipe the slate clean and start all over again with a new people. And Moses challenges him and says, but what about your namesake? What will the other nations around think of you then? That's pretty kind of confident stuff to be talking to God like that. Hannah poured out her sorrow and all her angst in asking God for a child. And King David, penned many of the Psalms that are included in the form of prayer, praise, lament, petition for justice, and declaring God as his refuge. We've got Elijah, who's a great man of faith. He kind of stood up against the evil king Ahab, and he prayed 7 times in faith and expectation for rain to come after years of drought. And he kept going until his servant said, I can just about see a tiny cloud on the horizon. And that was it. He knew that the prayers were answered. Isaiah was an incredible guy. He had a real deep intimacy prayer life, so much that God revealed to him specific prophetic words of things that were going to happen hundreds of years in advance. So including, of course, Jesus. Daniel rhythmically set his face to Jerusalem. He prayed 3 times a day against the decree of the emperor at the time. And Esther, who was a queen of Persia and a Jew, called her people to fast and pray as she sought to bring down the evil anti-Semite Haman, who was planning a mass genocide of the Jews. We've got Nehemiah, who starts with confession. He confesses his sins. He confesses his sins personally, his family, his people. But in the end, he reminds God of his promises in deliverance and mercy and prosperity. We've got Jeremiah, who humbly cries, "How long, O Lord?" and questions, why has the wicked way prospered so much? Mary, her prayer is ending up as a hymnal recital known as the Magnificat. It's sung in classical kind of like music in halls, etc. And then we've got the first Christians in Pentecost, 120 of them squeezed into a room, gathered together, all of the same heart, expectantly praying for the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. And they weren't disappointed. And the apostles who are writing the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, writings commonly just turn into prayers 42 times, in fact. The Apostle James encourages us to pray for healing, for forgiveness, and to be authentic in our prayer. And the Apostle John charts what some people say is the greatest prayer ever recorded. That is the prayer of Jesus to be glorified, the prayer for his disciples, and even for all believers. So yes, Jesus prayed for you, and it's in the Bible. And of course, we're going to be learning from Jesus later on. And yet, prayer is something that we all struggle with. Now, when I'm spiritually dry and I'm not very responsive, I guarantee I'm not talking to God much. And why is this? Well, it's easy to see there's so many distractions, more than ever before. It could be that you've been disappointed on your spiritual walk at times and you've kind of given up on prayer. It might be that you've just got so many questions about other things, even kind of spiritual things, that you're just not able to engage. Often there is something tangibly in front of us that demands our attention, always seems to be more important. And actually, one of the reasons why prayer is difficult is it requires faith for it to actually be real and living. And that can sometimes feel like a scary place. There's obviously many different types of prayer, different facets. It's a bit daunting. Where do I start? And prayer, when we're praying with others especially, exposes the state of our innermost being. What is inside comes out. And that takes it on to a whole new level. I remember when I was growing up and the first time I prayed out loud in a kind of a group setting with other Christians, my heart was pounding. I was building up the courage, feel the palpitations, a little bit sweaty, a little bit on edge. And then I kind of felt like I jumped off a massive cliff into the kind of the river below. And I don't even remember what I prayed. All I know is that the people who were around were more encouraged that I had prayed than anything that I actually just said. Sometimes I know prayer meetings can be kind of quite arduous. You know, you've got to press through. And there have been ones where I've felt, man, I am just desperate to get home. But there's others that I'm just desperate for them not to end. And the way I kind of like contextualize it is it's a bit like exercise. Prayer is spiritual exercise. If we don't exercise at all, we become slovenly, our bodies lose strength, and we can even become ill. And yet the more you do, the more you can do. At times, it requires perseverance, and you can feel the struggle. At times, it can be exhilarating. It takes you to new places that you couldn't imagine, giving you a new perspective. And there's so many types of exercise. There is wrestling. There's just brief exercise. There's long distance running. There's supporting your teammates. There's doing things, pressing on your own. Another analogy is kind of mining, which I'm told requires lots of hard graft to dig that crucial shaft. And then finally, someone lights the fuse, and anyone could do that. Boom! What looks like an impenetrable mountain is now a source of blessing and opportunity. And it's really because we recognize the importance of prayer as a church, we're embarking on this prayer course together. So whether you count yourself as a member of Storyhouse Church or not, you're welcome to sign up and join us. The disciples spent time with Jesus. They saw their need for direction and for teaching on prayer. So let's encourage one another in this vital aspect of discipleship and relationship. And I am fully expectant that we are going to grow in faith. We're going to see people grow in joy, in confidence, in purpose, in peace. And as that relationship develops, we're going to expect to see an impact on church and also kind of on our community around, that God is going to bring people into new giftings. People are going to hear God's voice more clearly, greater direction, prophetic kind of words, etc. God has given us so much. He's still got so much to give, but it starts with walking life with him together. So the prayer course, just in brief, as we've mentioned, put together by Pete Gregg. And although it's not kind of necessarily something that's a format that has to be kept to, we're going to be kind of building things around the PRAY, that is pause, rejoice, ask and yield, because it gives us something that actually rhythmically helps us kind of move through different aspects of prayer without just getting self-centered on God, I've got this need, please could you help me? And that is where the course is really kind of like well-rounded, because it unpacks these different aspects of prayer. Firstly, we've got centering on God, that is how to be still before God. We've got adoration, how to worship God, petition, asking God for things, intercession, how to ask God for others, contemplation. Actually, what does it mean to talk to God without actually using words? We've got listening and actually developing that prophetic gifting about what does God want to say to you? What does God want to say to me? Confession and reconciliation, how to get right with God, and spiritual warfare, how to exercise spiritual authority through prayer. What is the role of the Holy Spirit in prayer? Praying on our behalf and giving us gifts such as the gift of languages, sometimes called the gift of tongues. That's an incredible gift that is pretty strange in one way, but one that really, for me personally, kind of in my personal prayer life, just enables me to go up to the next level. When I'm struggling to know how to start, I just pray in tongues, and wow, I'm just in there. I'm in there and I'm on there with God in a way that actually just accelerates everything in my prayer. What about fasting? That is really something that we look at. As someone who eats a lot of food, fasting can be quite arduous, can be quite difficult, and yet it's a spiritual exercise that brings kind of breakthrough. So there's going to be lots of stories similar to other courses. We're going to have a video, breakouts for discussion, backed up with obviously the How to Pray book, and please let us know if you'd like kind of the actual Teach Us to Pray materials. We want to include you in this. So just for a moment, I want you to kind of pretend you're not listening to me on the internet at the minute. You're actually sitting on a rock at the edge of an olive grove, and there's a good bunch of us around Jesus, but we're kind of close enough to able to hear him easily speak and ask him questions. And John says, Lord, teach us how to pray. So let's reflect back on those words that Laura shared in Matthew chapter 6. Well, in the original kind of Hebrew, it was just 31 words, and Jesus has managed to cover all 9 forms of prayer, and he's provided us with some key principles that's backed up by his own observable prayer life. To quote Archbishop Justin Welby, the Lord's Prayer, it's simple enough to be memorized by children, but profound enough to sustain a whole lifetime of prayer. Now, we're going to leave some of that exposition to the prayer course, but I just want to focus on the first line. Our Father in heaven. The creator of the universe is inviting you to address him as Father, even Dad. So how do we get to the Father? Well, we get to the Father through Jesus. Jesus said, no one gets to the Father but through me, because it's actually through accepting the sacrifice that Jesus has made and salvation through that sacrifice, in actually receiving kind of forgiveness, that brings us to a point that enables us to have access to the Father. So we're still acknowledging his cosmic position. We're still starting with worship, but unique to Christians, it's actually about the family. And in the book, I dared to call him Father. A high-ranking, noble Pakistani woman, Begum Belguis, was discontented with her life. She sought deeper truth through the Quran, but she was drawn to the frequent references to Jesus as a prophet. And she managed to source a Bible, and after inquiring through some Christian missionaries, he started having dreams and visions that reflected the Trinity of God the Father, Jesus the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Now, in becoming a Christian, led to a house being torched. She had to flee the country. But the book charts the intimacy of what it means to be a child of God and that ongoing dialogue. And sometimes it's only when we recognize what else is out there, different cultures, different religions, that actually we see how unique this is in Christianity, that through Jesus we have access to the throne room of God, and yet he asks us to refer to him as Father. So, yeah, sometimes we're talking a bit theoretical and technique, but it's not really about that. It's about relationship and family. And to quote Dallas Willard, prayer is talking to God about what we are doing together. That is what you and God are doing together. So next time you pray, I'd like to invite you to start with the words Father. And finally, let's just reflect on some of those other principles that Jesus laid down. So in the first few verses, we hear Jesus actually comparing what it would be like to pray versus other types of people who are praying. Praying as a Christian versus kind of like the prayers that other people might have seen happening around them. And so the first thing is keep it simple. Verses 5 and 7 say, when you pray, don't be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues at the street corners, that they might be seen by others. They've received their reward. But when you pray, go into your room, shut the door, pray to your Father who is in secret. Your Father who is in secret will reward you. God's not looking for a fanfare. He's not looking for a performance. In actual fact, it's that secret conversation that counts. And Jesus says he will reward that. Sometimes we can look at inspirational heroes of the faith, people like Martin Luther, Praying Hyde, Rees Howell, that all had incredible prayer lives, saw incredible answers to prayer. And we can compare ourselves to them and think, well, that's obviously the way to go. But in actual fact, some of these kind of people had an amazing gifting. That was almost a special gifting, special calling in prayer. And to try and replicate that can actually lead us to feel uncalled guilt and feel like abandoning prayer. So there might be heroic periods of prayer, but with absolutely no intention to be heroic in the first place. Jesus is just asking us to just come in simplicity where we're at. And we often say at Story House Church, God is looking to make us faithful, not famous. The second thing is keep it honest. So likewise, Jesus comments, those rigid repetitions, babbling on with masses of empty words, is just not required. Do you like hanging out with people who talk like that? God, our Father, feels the same way. He's not interested in us keeping up appearances. And in fact, that facade will be a barrier to deeper breakthrough spiritually. Instead, he's looking for honesty. You might be out gazing at what we've had is 5 days of lovely blue sky, which is kind of a record in Crosby, laying down on the grass. Just tell God how thankful you are. use that as a springboard to focus on his creation and his sovereignty. Or it may be that you're just full of frustration and emotion, and actually channeling that emotion into a place of real conversation and honesty with God is really powerful. It's a great place to start. But don't leave it there. Let God speak to you and allow him to move you on from it. There's no more honest place and state of heart when distractions are not there, in a room that you feel secure in, just there between you and God. And if shutting the door is not enough, then turn your phone off too. Number 3 is keep it going. And in Thessalonians, the Apostle Paul encourages the small Thessalonian church to rejoice always, pray without ceasing, and give thanks to God in all circumstances. This is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. So praying at all times. And Jesus gave us the parable of the judge and the widow to encourage us to keep going. Now, there's a few kind of practical things that we can learn from Jesus' example that can help us keep going. The first one is try and get or identify with a place that helps you pray. It might be a single place, or it might be some kind of something that you do. Jesus mentioned this: go into your room. There is an actual go, there is a location that mattered. And Jesus is often cited as going to a mountain to pray. For the early Jews, they had a tent, they had a place of meeting. That was the place that they most powerfully encountered God's presence. And this is a really helpful part of the pause aspect of prayer, is that you're taking yourself to a place where you can just settle your mind and focus, because prayer does need concentration and focus. For me, that's often been in my car. There's no interruptions. You can park up, you can just sit there a bit early. And to be fair, that has suffered a bit during lockdown, as I don't use my car quite as much. But it could be a walk that you go on. And I think this is where dog owners have really got a kind of an edge on us. Their dog gets them out. Their dog takes them away from the distractions. And the dog doesn't interrupt their prayer life with God. A few barks here and there. It could just be a chair at home. It might be a room. But that association helps us to mentally focus actually on prayer. Which leads us to number 2, which is develop some form of a pattern or rhythm. And to quote Pete Greig from the book, delight without discipline eventually dissipates. A great quote. Delight without discipline eventually dissipates. Jesus was observed to early in the morning get up while it was still dark, leaving the house and going to a solitary place. And likewise, it says in the evening, he often went out to the mount called Olives to pray. And it's getting these simple rhythms in place that Christians have done for millennia, which is why, often we just say grace, just settle down for 20 seconds with your kids around the table to say, actually, we're just going to acknowledge God as a family here. It might not be anything spectacular. And I know if you've got kids like mine, grace is a pretty fast prayer when you've got something nice to eat in front of you. But actually, it's just that simple rhythm. It might be when you get up. It might be when you go to bed at night. But set aside some time each day. I find when I walk through the door at work, I just say a prayer. It just says, Lord, I'm going to work, I'm starting this day, and it's your day, and it's acknowledging it as I go through kind of like the doorways of places. Could be your commute home, which for some of you guys is probably pretty short if you're working from home. And then praying with people, having somebody that you regularly kind of touch base with and actually share your heart. As you develop a prayer understanding with them, you can see yourselves as warriors on the same team. But do what works for you. However, do it regularly. And the third thing, which is probably a bit more personal to myself as somebody who doesn't necessarily develop kind of patterns and rhythms so easily, is be impulsive. Every conversation, every need that is shared is a trigger for prayer, potential trigger for prayer. And when we interpret praying without ceasing, we can consider that actually it's about always being ready to pray. It's about being on the verge of prayer. It's about grasping every prayer opportunity. And some of the best prayer moments that I've had have been at work where someone has shared a need and I've managed to spontaneously kind of like get in there and say something along the lines of, this might sound a bit weird, but as you know, I'm a Christian and that means that I pray for people. What you're going through sounds really tough. Would it be okay to pray for you? And they often say, yeah, that's fine. Can't hurt. They're a bit surprised when I kind of then, launch into prayer. But that's the moment to do it in, not to kind of walk out the room and kind of for it to be something that they don't see. So prayer turns what seems like a physical struggle into a spiritual opportunity, and God will put you in situations to do good. And let's not ignore that advancing his kingdom in that moment may also involve spontaneous prayer.